Back this week looking at the Exodus in light of the bigger story of salvation history. And boy, oh boy, do we have a lot to work with the Exodus. At a very basic level, one really powerful way, and basic, by the way, is very good. That's where 99.9% of people in the church are. So we should start there. The story of the Exodus really can be brought out by using a technique pioneered by the church fathers, and this is what we might call the idealistic interpretation of the story. Seeing, as we've kind of intimated before, seeing Israel as a representative of the human soul or the human person. So we have Israel being brought out of slavery to Egypt, the slavery being a sort of a physical bondage, but we see it also in the stories, in fact, really a spiritual bondage. And human beings also in their own way being born into a form of bondage, of this bondage being to sin and to death, as a writer like Paul might put it, this being also broken by a gratuitous act by God working in our lives individually, just as he worked in human history in the story in Egypt. So that's one level. So the actual idea of salvation works very well. Now, of course, in order to complete the salvation, there's of course a physical movement of the people away from Egypt across the Yam Suf, the famous Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. Probably, in fact, wasn't the Red Sea, which would have been a very, very long cross. Probably we're talking about one of the inlets north of the Red Sea in the area what's now called Goshen, that area. So the Sea of Reeds, the Sea of Bulrushes. But at any rate, Israel has to cross a watery barrier to be formally freed from its old state of captivity to its new state of freedom. And of course, that watery barrier to us corresponds to the sacrament of holy baptism. Baptism breaks the power of sin and death in us, and it also, in some kind of a more spiritual way, comprises a boundary now between the world that we're in now, the land we're living in now, so to speak, and the old land that we were in. That it's now divided by a watery barrier. We're part of a new people now, and we're living in a new place. Now, of course, we're not actually in our final destination yet in after our baptism, and neither was Israel. Israel, of course, as we know from the story, had to wander for 40 years in the desert, oftentimes succumbing to the temptation to rebel against the God who had originally saved her from slavery, and in fact, in many cases, longing to return to the state of slavery, of course, that she had in Egypt, which in fact was not really all that bad, but in many ways was better, at least in her eyes, than the life that she had wandering in the desert. And of course, the desert corresponds to our own sort of intermediate stage of existence. And if you want to think of this in terms of highfalutin eschatological terminology, it's a sort of realized eschatology. It's the salvation that we have, but we haven't yet quite gotten it. It's a here and now, but not yet. We're out of Egypt, but we're not quite in Canaan. We're out of slavery, but we're not quite in the promised land yet. We have the beginnings of the victory over sin and death in us, but not the fullness of victory. And so there's always a temptation then to sort of backslide and to succumb to rebellion and ultimately to surrender once again to the gods that the one God has delivered us from. And of course, that's exactly what happened to the first generation. All of them had to die, at the end of the 40-year period before any of them were able to enter into the promised land. And of course, then there's another final conquest. We haven't actually gotten to that part of the story yet, but we will soon enough, where Israel once again has to cross another little watery barrier that perhaps corresponds to the final cleansing maybe that we might expect in purgatory. And then, of course, Israel then reaches her heavenly goal, which corresponds to life in the promised land. Okay, so that's the idealistic version of the story. And indeed, it finds probably its greatest crystallization in the famous fourfold senses of Scripture for interpreting the Bible. The literal sense is sort of the foundational one. That's the literal sense might in this way correspond to what the story itself says to us. The story itself is exactly what it says. It's about Egypt being liberated by God, Israel being liberated by God from Egypt, and eventually, after a period of 40 years, arriving in the land of promise. Okay, so that's the literal sense, a literal/historical sense. Okay, but however, there's an allegory as well, or we might say better still, a typology. The typological sense in this case would be what? Well, there's many layers of typology, but I here would focus on the crossing of the Red Sea corresponding to the sacrament of baptism. Just as the crossing of the Red Sea symbolizes in effect the destruction of the forces of sin and death, because the Egyptian armies are destroyed, it also affects freedom for the Israelites. So there's an instructive aspect to this, the allegory here of baptism. And of course, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, of course, makes this exact equation between the baptism, so to speak, that Israel underwent when it crossed the Red Sea to the baptism that Christians undergo now. Okay, so that's the second sense, the allegorical or the typological sense. Then finally, we have two other senses, the third of which is the tropological sense. The tropological sense, or sometimes called the moral sense, is what we do. In other words, what we do once we have gotten the literal sense and gotten the allegorical typological sense. What are we supposed to do with this now? How do we live? Okay, so that corresponds to what we do in the wilderness of our own lives. Do we or do we not follow the example of the Israelites who rebelled against the Lord at Meribah and Massah? Or do we remain faithful like Moses and Joshua and Caleb? So in other words, this is the choice that's before all of us. So that's the tropological sense. And finally, there's the anagogical sense. The anagogical sense here, or the prophetic sense, asks the question, where is this all headed? Just as this story heads and reaches a climax at the conquest by Israel of the Promised Land, the sort of gratuitous entry into the Promised Land, so our entry into the new world is the eschatological reality that we have to look forward to. So you see the fourfold sense here at work. The literal sense, the typological or allegorical sense, the tropological or moral sense, the third sense, and the fourth sense is the anagogical or prophetic sense. So this is indeed a very, very neat story to sort of encapsulate the whole church's doctrine on salvation, if you will, at a very basic level. So we'll start with that for now, and then I'll follow this up here with something more.